The silence of the mountain air was far more terrifying than the crushing weight in my chest. I lay on the damp earth, my cheek pressed against the biting cold of pine needles, watching the crimson glow of Mark's taillights vanish into the thick morning mist of the Blackwood wilderness. He wasn't driving toward the ranger station, and he wasn't going for help. He was driving back to a life that he and his mother had decided no longer had room for a dying woman. "It's the most merciful way, Mark." I had heard his mother's voice crackle through the car's Bluetooth just an hour earlier, her tone as clinical as a surgeon's. "Let nature take its course. If she passes at home, the state will freeze the accounts for months, and those medical bills will bleed your inheritance dry before the ink is even dry on the death certificate. This way, she just disappeared. You're a grieving husband, not a bankrupt one." I tried to scream, but my lungs felt as though they were filled with wet sand. I was 32 years old, and according to the woman who had hugged me at my wedding and the man who had promised to cherish me in sickness and in health, I was already a ghost. They had left me in the middle of a 3,000-acre forest with nothing but a light jacket and a bottle of water that I couldn't even reach. The betrayal was a sharper cold than the autumn frost creeping over my numb fingers. They wanted the house, the trust fund my grandfather had left me, and the freedom to move on without the burden of a wife whose health had begun to fail. Only a year ago, my life had been a tapestry of sunlight and the scent of expensive roasted coffee. We lived in a sprawling Victorian house on the edge of the city, a place of high ceilings and polished oak floors that I had spent years restoring. I remember the way the morning light used to hit the breakfast nook, turning the steam from my mug into a golden haze. Mark would come up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. "You're the heart of this house, Elena," he'd whisper. Back then, I believed him. He was a high-end landscape architect, talented but perpetually struggling with the business side of things, while I ran a successful boutique interior design firm. We were the golden couple of our social circle, the ones who seemed to have figured it all out. Then there was Evelyn, my mother-in-law. For the first 4 years of our marriage, she was a constant, albeit slightly suffocating presence. She was a woman of pearls and pointed barbs, always suggesting better ways to fold the linens, or reminding Mark that he deserved a wife who spent more time in the kitchen and less time at job sites. She lived in a small, cramped apartment that she despised, often lamenting the greatness her family had lost 2 generations ago. She looked at our home, my home, bought with my inheritance, with a hunger that I mistook for pride. "It's such a shame this house is only in your name, dear," Evelyn had said one Sunday afternoon, her eyes tracing the intricate crown molding in the parlor. We were sipping tea, the delicate china clinking in the heavy silence. "In my day, a marriage was a true partnership. Everything was shared. It seems so transactional this way, don't you think? As if you don't fully trust my Mark." "It's a family legacy, Evelyn," I had replied firmly, though I kept my voice sweet. "My grandfather wanted to ensure I always had a roof over my head. It has nothing to do with trust." Mark had looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable. "Mom's just old-fashioned, Elle. She doesn't mean anything by it." But I noticed then, for the first time, how he didn't look at me. He looked at the fireplace, at the expensive Persian rug, at anything but my eyes. The decline started slowly. It began with a persistent fatigue that I chalked up to overwork. Then came the tremors in my hands, making it impossible to sketch my designs. I went to the doctors, but the tests were always inconclusive, showing only elevated levels of stress hormones and unspecified inflammation. It was Evelyn who stepped in to help. She began coming over every day, brewing special herbal blends she claimed were from an old family recipe. "To soothe the nerves, Elena, you're working yourself into an early grave." I felt touched by her concern. I grew to depend on those teas, on the way she would tuck a blanket around my legs as I spent more and more time on the sofa. Mark became quieter, his affection replaced by a sort of frantic, nervous energy. He stopped talking about our future and started talking about contingencies. "If things get worse, Elle, we need to make sure the estate is protected." he told me one night, sitting on the edge of the bed while I struggled to keep my eyes open. The medical costs for these specialists are astronomical. Maybe we should look into transferring the deed, just for safekeeping, to keep the lawyers away. I'm not dying, Mark, I had whispered, though my own voice sounded distant to me. I'm just tired. I'll get better. He didn't answer. He just turned off the bedside lamp, leaving us in a darkness that felt thicker and heavier than it ever had before. I didn't know then that the tea Evelyn prepared was laced with a slow-acting sedative and a cocktail of minerals designed to mimic the symptoms of a degenerative neurological disorder. I didn't know that my husband was watching me fade away, not with sorrow, but with a calculated impatience. The healing retreat to the Blackwood Wilderness was supposed to be our last-ditch effort to reconnect and find peace away from the city. Mark had packed the car with such care, telling me the fresh mountain air would do more for me than any hospital. Even Evelyn had come to see us off, kissing my cheek with lips that felt like dry parchment. "Rest well, Elena," she had whispered. "You won't have to worry about a thing anymore." Now, as the freezing dampness of the forest floor began to seep through my clothes, I realized the true meaning of her words. I wasn't there to heal. I was there to be erased. The dying wife was a role they had written for me, and they had just reached the final act. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic reminder that despite their plans, I was still breathing. I was still here. And as the first light of a cold, gray dawn began to filter through the canopy, the fog in my brain, the fog they had carefully cultivated with every cup of tea, began to lift, replaced by a searing, white-hot spark of rage. The weeks leading up to that fateful trip were a blur of shadows and hushed voices. Looking back, the signs were as bright as flares in a night sky, but I was too shrouded in my own physical decline to see them for what they were. It started with my business. Sarah, my lead designer and closest friend, called me one Tuesday morning, her voice laced with a hesitation I'd never heard before. "Elena," she whispered, "I didn't want to bring this up while you're so sick, but the bank contacted me about the business line of credit. There's a request to liquidate the reserve account. It has your digital signature, but the IP address came from your home network. Did you authorize this?" I remember sitting in my armchair, the phone trembling in my hand. "No, Sarah. I haven't even logged into the business portal in weeks. I can barely see the screen. It must be a mistake. I'll talk to Mark." When I confronted him that evening, Mark didn't flinch. He just sighed, a sound of heavy, performative exhaustion, and knelt by my chair. Honey, your memory is just so foggy lately. We talked about this. The medical bills are piling up, and the insurance is fighting the last round of specialists. We needed that liquidity to keep the house running. You signed the authorization last Friday, remember?" I didn't remember. I didn't remember because it hadn't happened, but the way he looked at me, with such profound, weary pity, made me doubt my own sanity. That was their greatest weapon, the slow erosion of my trust in my own mind. Evelyn was always there to reinforce it. She began showing up with a notary friend of hers, a man named Mr. Henderson, who smelled of stale tobacco and didn't look me in the eye. "Just some standard paperwork, dear," Evelyn would coo, sliding documents in front of me while I was still reeling from the midday healing tea she brewed. "To ensure Mark can handle the estate if you need to go into a long-term care facility. It's for your protection." The first real chill of terror, the kind that doesn't come from a fever, hit me 3 days before we left for the mountains. I had skipped the tea that morning because I'd accidentally knocked the cup over, and for the first time in weeks, my head felt strangely clear. I was looking for my passport in Mark's study when I found a leather-bound folder tucked behind a row of architectural books. My hands shook as I opened it. It wasn't full of medical records. It was a dossier on the Blackwood Wilderness, topographical maps, trail closures, and a printed article about the difficulty of locating missing persons in dense terrain. Taped to the inside of the folder was a handwritten note in Evelyn's sharp, slanted script. "The northern ridge is best. No cell service for 10 miles. The search will take days, and by then, Nature will have finished what the illness started. Make sure she signs the final deed transfer before you leave." The room began to spin, but not from the medication. The air suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the house. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a dull roar growing in my ears. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to lean against the mahogany desk to keep from collapsing. They weren't waiting for me to get better. They weren't even waiting for me to die. They were planning to dispose of me. I heard the front door click shut. Mark was home early. I scrambled to replace the folder, my movements clumsy and frantic. My pulse was a frantic rhythm in my throat, each beat a drum of pure panic. I barely made it back to the living room sofa before he walked in. He was carrying a new hiking backpack, the tags still swinging from the straps. "Hey, sleepyhead," he said, his voice terrifyingly normal. He walked over and kissed my forehead. His skin felt like ice. "I've got everything ready for the retreat. The fresh air is going to be a miracle for you, Elle. I can feel it." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the man I had married. I saw a stranger wearing my husband's face. I saw the calculation in the tilt of his head, the way he avoided my gaze while he spoke of miracles. I wanted to scream, to run out the door and never look back, but my legs felt like lead. The sedatives from the previous night were still in my system, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I was a prisoner in my own home. That night, I lay awake in the dark, listening to Mark's rhythmic breathing. It felt like being trapped in a tomb with your own executioner. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that the note from Evelyn was just some sick, misplaced concern, or that I'd misunderstood the maps. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard the muffled sound of a conversation from the kitchen. I dragged myself out of bed, creeping toward the hallway, my bare feet silent on the cold oak. Mark was on the phone, his voice a low, jagged whisper. "I don't know, Mom. She looked at me strange today. I think the dosage is off." "Don't lose your nerve now, Mark." Evelyn's voice came through the speaker, sharp and cold as a winter wind. "The house is already in the holding company's name. We just need the physical absence. Once she's gone, the life insurance policy pays out double for accidental death in the wilderness. It's the only way to clear your debts and keep the lifestyle you've grown accustomed to. Do you want to lose everything because you grew a conscience at the 11th hour?" "No," Mark said, his voice cracking. I didn't think it would be this hard." "It's not hard," she snapped. "It's a mercy. She's suffering, isn't she? You're just helping her find peace, and helping us find our future. Pack the car. We leave at dawn." I leaned my head against the wall, the wood feeling like it was bruising my skin. The betrayal wasn't a sudden blow. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation. They were talking about my life as if it were a ledger to be balanced, a nuisance to be cleared. My stomach turned, and I had to clench my jaw to keep from retching. In that moment, the woman I had been, the trusting, loving wife, died. In her place, something cold and sharp began to form in the center of my chest. I realized I couldn't fight them then. I was too weak, too drugged. I had to play the part. I had to go into those woods. I had to survive the mercy they had planned for me. I didn't die. The rage was more potent than any sedative they had pumped into my system. It took 3 hours of crawling through the underbrush, my fingernails torn and bleeding as I dragged my unresponsive legs, before I reached the logging road. A truck driver named Silas found me, a ghost of a woman covered in pine needles and dried mud, and he didn't ask questions until he'd wrapped me in a wool blanket and cranked the heater to its limit. I didn't tell him I was running from a murder attempt. I told him I'd gotten lost. I needed to get back to the city, but not to a hospital. I needed to go home. When I stepped out of the taxi 2 blocks from our Victorian, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the pavement. My legs were shaky, but the paralysis was gone, replaced by a cold, vibrating clarity. I didn't enter through the front. I used the gardener's key hidden under the stone gargoyle by the side gate and slipped into the kitchen. The smell hit me first. Not the scent of my home, but the cloying, heavy odor of Evelyn's lily-of-the-valley perfume. It was everywhere. I moved toward the dining room, my heart hammering so loudly in my ears I thought it would alert them. I stopped in the shadows of the hallway. They were there. Mark was sitting at the head of the oak table, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. He looked haggard, his eyes red-rimmed, but he wasn't crying. He was staring at a stack of documents. Evelyn was standing behind him, her hands on his shoulders, kneading the tension there with a terrifyingly maternal rhythm. "You did the right thing, Mark," she was saying, her voice smooth and chilling. "The report is filed. The missing person protocol is in place. In 48 hours, we'll have the emergency conservatorship approved. We can finally sell this drafty mausoleum and get you that firm in the city you've always wanted." "I left her there, Mom," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. He didn't look up. "She was looking at me through the window when I drove away. She looked so small." "She was a shell, Mark. The illness had already taken her. You just accelerated the inevitable. Now, sign the transfer for the jewelry collection. There's no point in it sitting in a safe where the state can tax it." I stepped out of the shadows. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was a rasp, a sound from the bottom of a well. "I'm not a shell yet, Mark." The glass in Mark's hand didn't just slip. It shattered against the table, amber liquid spraying across the legal papers. He bolted upright, his chair clattering to the floor. His face went a shade of gray I didn't know the human skin could achieve. He began to hyperventilate, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Elena?" he choked out. Evelyn was faster to recover. She didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just narrowed her eyes, her grip tightening on the back of Mark's chair. You shouldn't be here, Elena. You're very sick. You're hallucinating." "Is that the new script?" I walked closer, leaning against the table for support because my knees felt like water. "I'm not sick, Evelyn. I was being poisoned. I found the dossier in Mark's study. I heard the phone call. I heard you tell him to let nature take its course." "You're hysterical," Evelyn snapped, stepping around the table to put herself between me and Mark. "Mark, call the private ambulance we discussed. She's had a breakdown. She wandered off in the woods and now she's having a psychotic break. Look at her. She's covered in filth. She's dangerous." Mark didn't move. He didn't call anyone. He just stood there, paralyzed, looking from me to his mother and back again. His eyes were wide with a pathetic, cowardly terror. He wouldn't even look at my face. He was staring at the mud on my shoes. "Say something, Mark!" I screamed, the sound tearing through my throat. "Tell her you didn't mean to leave me to die. Tell me you weren't the one who put those minerals in my vitamins every morning for 6 months." Mark's silence was a physical blow. He looked down at the shattered glass on the table and mumbled, I did it for us, Elle. We were drowning in debt. The business, it was all going under. Mom said, she said it was the only way to save our future." "Our future?" I let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "You were trading my life for a firm in the city? You were killing me for a paycheck, Mark." "It wasn't like that." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, weak anger. "You were always so controlled, so perfect with your inheritance and your house. I was just an employee in my own marriage. I needed my own life." "So you decided to end mine?" "Enough of this drama!" Evelyn barked. She reached into her silk handbag and pulled out a cell phone. "I'm calling the police. I'll tell them you attacked us. I'll tell them you've been threatening suicide and that you finally snapped. Who are they going to believe? A respected architect and his grieving mother? Or a woman who looks like she crawled out of a grave?" She began to dial, her face a mask of cold, calculated malice. She actually smiled at me, a tiny, triumphant upturn of her lips. "You should have stayed in the woods, Elena. It would have been so much cleaner." The second twist came then. I didn't try to stop her from calling. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my jacket, the jacket Mark had so kindly let me keep, and pulled out the small, voice-activated recorder I had taken from my office weeks ago when I first started feeling foggy and wanted to track my own memory lapses. It had been running since the moment I stepped into the kitchen. "Go ahead, Evelyn. Call them," I whispered, my voice steady now. "I'd love for them to hear the recording of you admitting to accelerating the inevitable and discussing how to dodge taxes on my jewelry. And I'm sure the forensic team will be very interested in the special tea still sitting in the pot on the stove." The color finally drained from Evelyn's face. The phone in her hand began to tremble. For the first time, the predator realized she was standing in a trap. "And Mark," I said, turning to my husband, who was still frozen in his silence. "I checked the desk before I left. You were so sloppy. You didn't just keep maps. You kept the receipts for the illegal substances you bought online. You kept them in the same folder as our wedding photos." The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, a pathetic, sobbing sound escaping his throat. Evelyn looked at her son with pure, unadulterated disgust, then turned that same look on me. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're still a dying woman, Elena. Look at your hands. You can barely stand. Even if you send us to jail, you'll be dead in a year, and this house will go to the state anyway. I've already moved the deed into a shell company you can't touch." "Actually," I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face as the third realization hit her. "That shell company? The one you registered in the Cayman Islands? You used my digital signature to authorize the transfer, which means, legally, I am the sole owner of that company. You didn't steal my house, Evelyn. You just gave me all your hidden assets." The internal click was almost audible, a sharp, crystalline snap in the center of my being. For months, I had been a ghost haunting my own life, a shivering creature of shadow and self-doubt. But as I stood in my kitchen, watching Evelyn's face crumple with the realization that her greed had outsmarted itself, the last of the sedative fog evaporated. The weakness was still in my limbs, but it was no longer in my soul. I felt a cold, predatory focus settle over me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was the architect of their ruin. "You should leave now, Evelyn," I said, my voice so calm it seemed to startle even the air in the room. "And Mark, you should stay. The police are already on their way." I pressed the emergency alert on my watch the moment I stepped onto the porch. Evelyn made a lunging movement toward the recorder in my hand, her face contorted into a mask of pure, animalistic rage. "Give me that, you little bitch! You think you can ruin us? This is my family! This is my son's legacy!" I didn't flinch. I didn't even move. "Your son's legacy is a prison cell and a public record of cowardice," I said, the words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. This was the woman who had tried to brew my death in a teapot. "And as for the house, I've already sent a copy of the deed transfer you forged to my attorney. By tomorrow morning, the shell company will be dissolved, and every cent you funneled into it will be frozen as evidence of grand larceny." Mark finally found his voice, though it was a thin, pathetic thing. Elena, please. We can fix this. I was confused. I was scared. She told me you were already gone. She said I was just helping you pass with dignity." I looked at him, really looked at him. The man I had loved was nowhere to be found. In his place was a hollowed-out shell of a human, a middle-aged boy who had traded his wife's life for his mother's approval and a debt-free bank account. "Dignity, Mark? You left me in the dirt like a bag of trash. You didn't even have the courage to wait until my heart stopped before you started spending my money." The blue and red lights began to dance against the kitchen window, cutting through the evening gloom. The retribution was swift and clinical. When the police entered, Evelyn tried to play the role of the concerned mother-in-law, dealing with a deranged terminal patient, but the recording didn't lie. The special tea was bagged as evidence, and the dossier I had retrieved from the study was the final nail in their coffin. Mark, ever the coward, didn't even wait for a lawyer before he began sobbing out a confession, pointing his finger at his mother, begging for a plea deal before the handcuffs were even clicked shut around his wrists. The months that followed were a grueling journey of reclamation. The neurological disorder vanished within 6 weeks of stopping Evelyn's herbal concoctions. The doctors at the hospital were horrified. They found traces of arsenic and heavy metals in my blood, enough to make me a permanent invalid, but not enough to kill me quickly. It was a slow, agonizing murder. I spent a year healing. I purged the house of every trace of them. I tore up the Persian rugs where they had stood and plotted. I repainted the walls, stripping away the colors they had chosen, replacing them with a bright, defiant white. I took back my firm, and with Sarah's help, we turned it into a powerhouse. I was no longer the golden girl. I was the woman who had returned from the wilderness, and that iron was reflected in everything I touched. Exactly 1 year to the day after Mark had left me in the Blackwood wilderness, I was sitting on my porch. The air was crisp, scented with the late autumn leaves, and the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple. I was sipping real tea, the steam warming my face, when a rusted, nondescript sedan pulled into the driveway. The door opened, and Mark stepped out. He looked 20 years older. He was thinner, his clothes were wrinkled, and the arrogance that had once defined his posture was gone, replaced by a permanent, slinking stoop. He had taken a plea deal, probation, and a suspended sentence in exchange for testifying against his mother. Evelyn was currently serving 10 years for attempted murder and financial fraud. He walked up the path, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't look at me. He looked at the house, his eyes hungry and hollow. "Elena," he whispered, I just wanted to see if you were okay. I've been living in a motel. I have nothing. The legal fees took everything Mom had hidden, and the firm, no one will hire me. I thought, maybe since you're better now, maybe we could talk about why things happened the way they did." I stood up, my movements fluid and strong. I walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at the stranger who used to share my bed. I felt no anger, no heat, just a profound, echoing emptiness. "You left me to die in the wilderness, Mark," I said, my voice steady. "You chose a year of my life for a house you didn't earn. You don't get to come back and ask for the pieces of the heart you tried to stop." "I was under her thumb, Elle. You know how she is." He took a step up, his hand reaching out as if to touch my hem. "I still love you. I made a mistake." "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary, Mark. Leaving your wife to be eaten by wolves is a choice." I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time, he saw the woman I had become, the one he had forged in the cold of the Blackwood forest. "You spent a year waiting for me to die. I spent a year learning how to live without the weight of your betrayal." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. I tossed it, and it landed with a dull thud in the dirt at his feet. It was his wedding ring, the gold tarnished and dull. "The house is mine, the life is mine, and the wilderness? I left it behind a long time ago. I suggest you go find yours." I turned my back on him and walked into the warmth of my home, locking the door with a firm, satisfying click. As I sat back down in the quiet of my living room, watching the stars begin to poke through the velvet sky, I realized that the mountains hadn't been my end. They had been my forge. I was no longer waiting for the light to hit the breakfast nook. I was the light. And some ghosts, once exorcised, are never allowed back inside.